I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in me.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, so today we have Dr. Daniel Brenner. Welcome, Dr. Brenner, to The Boundless Body.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so I'm just going to read out your bio and then we'll catapult ourselves into pharmacology and clinical work regarding ketamine and so on.
Great. Looking forward to it. Good.
All right, I'm looking forward to it. So Dr. Daniel Brenner is a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst with a private practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as well as a medical director at Cambridge Biotherapies, which includes Cambridge Ketamine and Cambridge Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation. We'll talk about that a little bit. So he received a BA from Harvard, as well as an MD from Tufts Medical School, and was resident in psychiatry at the Cambridge Health Alliance, Harvard Medical School, where he was chief resident in the outpatient department. Following residency, he was a fellow at the program for psychotherapy at Cambridge Hospital. He served as clinical instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School from 2000 to 2010, and was a member of the teaching staff for the Introduction to Psychiatry course at Harvard Medical School. So thanks for coming on the show, Dr. B.
It's me.
That's what my students like to call me, like after we get to know each other a little bit.
All right.
So we got two Dr. B's here.
All right.
So can you tell us a little bit about what got you passionate about getting into transcranial magnetic stimulation? What got you interested in ketamine? How about just an autobiographical, broad brushstrokes about what got you into the healing arts and sciences?
Sure, gladly. I was raised on the Upper West Side, Manhattan. Both of my parents are clinical psychologists. So I sort of grew up immersed in the language and the culture of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I tried for many years to resist my pull to the same field because, I was a young guy and I wanted to do my own thing. And I had lots of other interests. For a good part of my life, I was very interested in music, still am. So I spent some time writing music for movies and playing in bands and things like that, making records. After college, during a kind of a bit of a lost period in my life, my brother really forced me to go into therapy and got to drag me there. And it was a totally life-changing experience. The first therapist I saw was a guy named Robert Oken, who I adore, who was chief of psychiatry eventually at San Francisco General. And he did this very confrontational kind of anxiety-provoking therapy in which he would really work hard to break me down, and there were 3-hour sessions and everything was videotaped. And that turned out to be right for me at the time because I think I was a tough nut to crack. It really was transformative for me and very liberating, and kind of precipitated my interest in going back to school and becoming a psychiatrist. So I went to medical school really knowing this is what I wanted to do. Toward the end of in medical school and residency, I was in psychoanalysis, which is, as I'm sure your listeners know, it's a very intensive kind of psychotherapy, 5 days a week over a number of years. And that was very inspiring to me. I think it helped me in countless ways in my life. It helped me get married. It helped me become a father. It helped me feel more comfortable in my role as a therapist. And then for a number of years, I was just primarily in private practice as a psychotherapist and a psychoanalyst. But I was seeing all along patients that I had seen for many years who had really severe mental illness, schizophrenia, and serious major depression. I was doing some medication management for them. And actually what happened was, in my psychoanalytic training, a lot of my older colleagues who had been prescribers had sort of backed away from prescribing. So they began to send me challenging patients in consultation for medication ideas and things like that. And that kind of prompted a resurgence of my interest in the biology. And I kind of did a turnaround after 8 years of psychoanalytic training and a lot of private practice as a therapist. I just got totally inspired by the biology part of it too. And what brought me to ketamine and TMS, and eventually, more recently, to what's called ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, was the feeling that there were so many patients that I was seeing and other people were seeing who were either not responding to the traditional meds, being made, worse. There was a lot of adverse outcomes that I was seeing that were side effects of medications, and people who were not doing that great in therapy. And so I started to really get interested in, well, what else do we have in the toolbox? And my interest in the stuff like ketamine and TMS really came from me referring one or two patients that I had who had tried literally everything, every medication, ECT, psychotherapy, 15 forms of psychotherapy with nothing. And they both happened to respond very dramatically to TMS. And they came back to me and said, well, it was extremely helpful, but it was an awful experience because it's done in a hospital with, white coats and fluorescent light. And it was very clinical and unpleasant as an experience. And I started to think, well, maybe I can do this in a much more healing setting where there's peace and quiet and attention to the environment and kindness. And so I started with TMS first and was finding really positive results for depression, anxiety, and OCD. So these were, in the beginning, people who had tried other medicines and had either partial response or no response. And that was a very eye-opening thing to see, how people responded to TMS. And then I was finding that they did better when you were very kind and caring and attentive to them. So I started to sort of combine the kind of all the therapy and alliance building that I had learned with this kind of really biological treatment. I developed the same interest in ketamine, another very kind of, at the time, out there biological intervention that was being studied in lots of places, but was not really being used clinically by many people outside of a hospital setting. And I had several patients that I referred, one to a study, who had this very dramatic result. And I figured, well, and the same response, it was a terrible experience. The ketamine really helped me. So I developed the same approach with ketamine. How could I do this in a way that was healing and compassionate and supportive in an environment where, as people say in the psychedelic therapy space, where we attended to that and setting, to mindset and the setting of where you do this treatment.
The Boundless Body podcast is brought to you by BiTap, the creators of a powerful bilateral stimulation tool for nervous system regulation. I use this tapping technology clinically because it's a wonderful, gentle, pulsatile, tactile stimulation that helps the brain to regulate experience. And what I mean by regulate experience is not just managing the bad stuff, but amplifying the good stuff. So these tappers aren't just used clinically, they're used in many different settings, including with frontline workers, people that have test anxiety, kids and parents, teachers and school counselors, people in addiction recovery, restless sleepers, and people that are struggling with pain management and medical issues. So the benefits are vast. You can go to the BiTap website to get your tappers to help with your nervous system, and you can enter the Brian10 code to get your discount. I hope you enjoy the show.
So I began really doing those too as interventions for patients that were referred to me, and the clinic grew. And then along the way, I started to develop an interest in this emerging, we'll call it, modality called ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And that is really mind-blowing. That is perhaps the most powerful intervention I've ever worked with or witnessed. We started seeing patients who, had tried everything, especially people who had tried psychotherapy and either were stuck or were not getting anything out of it. We started working with people who had severe trauma. And we found that intervention using maybe your listeners are familiar with family systems, internal family systems theory. We started using that approach in our ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So now Cambridge Biotherapies has kind of evolved into this place where, we see people for consultations, just if they need ideas about what else they can try. We also have a lot of tools at our disposal now, so we can suggest any of these treatments when people, have hurdles that they're not able to surmount with the traditional treatments. And now, as we're working with it more and more, I'm finding that TMS and ketamine are extremely safe, and we can talk about both of them in depth. They have always been thought of as kind of a last line of treatment, but the more people work with these things, the more they start to realize, why are we thinking about these as last line treatment? They're safer in many ways than many of the other medications we use. They work faster. They have fewer side effects. I think there's a reason for that, which is partly that in medicine, people are very slow to change for good reason. It's a conservative field. And a lot of people in psychiatry are trained, as I was, to talk to people and to write prescriptions. But these are both, for lack of a better word, procedures. So people have to come to the clinic and have something done. And it requires equipment. It requires, in the case of ketamine, IV equipment and nurses and all that kind of proper procedure. And so it's not something that psychiatrists are generally trained to do, even to this day. So I think there's a kind of general suspicion of these modalities. But the more I really talk with other practitioners in private practice, but also in hospital settings like Mass General and Brigham and Women's, and McLean, we are all finding that we should be using these more frequently and earlier in the decision tree. And as something else we can talk about, a lot of us are finding that when we use these interventions in younger people, we can avert identity questions that arise with long-term psychiatric treatment. Ketamine can be quite transformative for people, and we can talk about why. And I have been talking with other clinicians about this, that we've all had many experiences of treating people, younger people, who otherwise we would have referred to inpatient stays and would have been in long-term residential programs, and sometimes you can't avoid that. But sometimes you can do these interventions, they have a very high efficacy. You can really pull somebody out of it, and they can go on to develop an identity which is not about their illness. So there's a movement now to sort of intervene earlier. It's very promising. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question, and I'm happy to talk about any of these subjects.
Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit more about TMS for people that don't have an image for that. I'm imagining that, one of the reasons why this conservative field is turned off by psychedelics and turned off by like an electrical stimulation approach is often images in the public eye around electrical stimulation of the nervous system center around the old ECT stuff. It's not old, it's really effective stuff, right? ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, is really effective, but it requires anesthesia, and I think is still like this kind of archaic, put a stick in somebody's mouth or something like that. And like these horrid images of a psychiatric hospital and just like madness and just like white coats around. And, like you mentioned, suspicion, right? Perhaps that's one of the reasons why the stigma is there. But I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how TMS is different than ECT, what it looks like,
Sure.
Like clinically, and so that we can get an image for that.
Yeah. Well, I come from a very traditional medical training. Cambridge Hospital is very progressive and very much oriented towards psychotherapy, but, I still come from that tradition, and I was equally skeptical. It seemed ridiculous to me in the early papers that I read about it. Like, really, I had this kind of give me a break response. And then, over years, you start to see more and more papers and more research. And suddenly, for a curious person like me, I had to learn more. So TMS is very different from ECT. ECT involves administering anesthesia and then administering electrical energy to the brain to cause a whole brain seizure. And it was really discovered by the observation of people who had seizures spontaneously, who had remission from depression. So it grew out of evidence, but it's a very serious intervention. Occasionally there's permanent loss of memory, and it's kind of a big deal to have anesthesia a couple times a week and have a treatment like this. So it's a big deal. TMS is really different. It sounds from the outside similar, but it's really different. It uses magnetic pulses. So just to back up and give you a sense of how TMS for psychiatric conditions was developed, you have to go back really to the emergence of this thing called functional MRIs. And functional MRIs are ways of mapping in real time what is happening in someone's brain. So you can put somebody into an MRI and give them a task or ask them to recall a memory, and you can see where in the brain networks are lighting up. And what people found was that in a very predictable way, people with major depression had very characteristic and very predictable patterns of activation and deactivation in their brains. And it turns out that in people who are depressed, just about 100% of the time, an area in the brain called the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is very underactivated in depression. In a person who's not depressed, that part of your brain is on all the time, pretty much, and very central to a lot of higher functions like memory, attention, decision-making, many things. In many ways, it's the sort of switching point that distributes a lot of information to other parts of your brain. So when people are depressed, that part goes quiet. And you can see that because that part of your brain controls all these things that are a problem in depression, there's clearly circumstantially a relationship there. So neurologists had known for years that if you administer a magnetic pulse to a nerve, it'll fire. So neurologists were using these magnetic pulses, on arms and legs to diagnose problems with neurological connections. It's like you stimulate the circuit and you see if it works. You stimulate your arm with a magnet, your hand contracts. So somebody had the brilliant idea to try this with patients who are depressed. And what evolved from those early experiments is what we now know as TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation. So if we think about TMS for depression, what we do is we use a machine that's kind of the size of, an old Apple II computer, let's say, maybe a little bigger, and it has a paddle connected to it. And we first make a measurement of a person's head, and using certain kind of techniques, we locate where on your skull corresponds to your left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And then we can take this paddle and administer magnetic pulses. And it sounds, depending on how you do it, kind of like either bop, 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 or in kind of waves of pulses like grr, grr, grr. We send these magnetic impulses into the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this side. And what happens is that the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex starts to wake up. It's sort of like passive exercise for that part of your brain. It doesn't usually happen after one treatment, but if you do a series of treatments, that part of your brain begins to come back online. And so in some ways, it's a very simple principle and very direct. So you administer these pulses. You're not putting a medication into somebody's entire body. You're not giving their whole brain a seizure. In fact, during TMS, what you feel is like a tapping sensation on your skull, because the magnetic pulses are kind of tricking the peripheral nerves in your scalp into firing and contracting the muscles. So you get a little twitching sometimes in the scalp muscles, but your brain does not feel anything. Your brain has no nerve endings. It's kind of an endless loop of nerves. So it has no sensation to it. So you don't feel anything in your brain, and you don't feel any disorientation. There's no change in how you think. So you have a treatment. Treatments these days can last anywhere from 40 seconds to 9 minutes. They used to be much longer, but they're much more compact now. You have a treatment, you stand up and go. And then you either come back in an hour or you come back the next day. And you do a series of treatments like exercise. The response rate, let's talk about that first. Depending on how you do it, is anywhere from, let's say, 65% all the way up to 90% in treatment-resistant major depression. So These are really extraordinary efficacies. And when you compare those to traditional antidepressants, it's a very dramatic difference. When you look at meta-analyses of traditional antidepressants, Prozacs and Zoloft and all those things, they're good, but they really work about 38% of the time, something like that on average, which is better than nothing. But now we're talking about something that is more than twice as effective, with no side effects between treatments, can be done intensively, even over the course of several days, and produce better outcomes than waiting 6 weeks and adjusting doses with traditional meds. So it has a lot of advantages. The disadvantage is that people have to come for the treatment. So it's a little different than taking a pill once a day. It's a little bit more of a commitment. But we find that when TMS clinicians really know what they're doing, somebody can come in, have a treatment, be in and out in 15 minutes. When people respond to TMS, almost 100% of them are delighted to come back and do maintenance treatments as they need. Now, the cool thing about TMS is that you can deliver the pulses in a particular way when you deliver them intermittently, like a pulse or a couple of pulses, then a break, and then another wave of pulses and a break. You stimulate the network you're targeting. When you administer continuous pulses, either in one long series, you end up inhibiting networks. People started to realize that in anxiety, generally, when you look at fMRIs, the corresponding place on the right side of your brain, the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is an area that's the upper side of your forehead. In anxiety, the right side is overactive all the time. It's always on, burning kind of red hot. So what we have discovered is that when you administer continuous pulses, you quiet that part down. And it can be extremely effective for anxiety. In some ways, people respond faster to the anxiety protocols than to the depression protocols. But you can then use that same continuous approach to treat OCD, because OCD shows overactivation in other networks. So if you have a patient with OCD, you will likely find that an area along the top of the brain that happens to be called the supplementary motor area, which is connected to lots of other, subcortical networks, is overactive as well. So if you use continuous TMS and you inhibit the supplementary motor area, you can see remission of OCD symptoms. And OCD is a very challenging thing to treat. The gold standard is exposure therapy and SSRIs. but this is more effective than the SSRIs. If people have really intractable OCD, the gold standard is exposure and response prevention treatment. It's called a form of therapy, exposure therapy. But when you pair it with TMS, they work better together. So TMS is more of a technique. And over time, people are going to learn the patterns of activation and deactivation and all kinds of mental illnesses, and will be able to modify. It's great when people can modify their own networks in therapy, which is really what's happening in psychotherapy. But there are a lot of people who just can't do it. There are people who just can't turn that stuff on or off, no matter how much therapy they have. It works. Therapy is amazing. I'm a psychotherapist 90% of my day, but this is a way to really help people, and they don't have to do anything. There's no work involved. Psychotherapy is an amazing process, but it requires commitment, and you sort of get out of it what you put into it. If you don't have anything to put into it, TMS can jumpstart things. And so we have found with both ketamine and TMS that when people are in psychotherapy, psychotherapies begin to flourish. This is not a replacement, but it enhances the experience of being in psychotherapy, liberating for people. And they can get to the core issues and not just the overwhelming symptoms. So, some people can do it all in therapy, some people a little bit of an SSRI, but these are options that are a new approach with higher efficacy.
That's music to my ears.
Yeah.
As a somatic psychologist and a neuroscience professor, I really appreciate this kind of brain approach to therapy, but also work directly with the brain via stimulation of some kind. Me personally, I use touch. I'm a touch therapist. So
very similar kind of networks, right? You're activating.
Yeah. So I'm a craniosacral therapist trained in the traditional osteopathic manual manipulation style. So I put my hands on heads and who knows what kind of waveforms are moving, from body to body during touch. But there is some interesting evidence that tactile connective tissue nerve endings do process and waveforms, calcium ion waveforms. So there could be something to touch as well. But what I'm really interested in at the moment is you're addressing with depression and with anxiety, these dorsolateral prefrontal cortex regions. For example, when you have an agitated depression, that you're kind of toggling back and forth between these two regions, right? Because you have both. You have just this anxiety component plus the depression component.
Exactly. That's a very good observation, because when you treat both sides in depression, even if someone is not anxious, you get better outcomes than if you just treat one side. Interestingly, when you treat depression by treating the right side, the anxious side, with inhibitory TMS, you generally get the same efficacy.
Interesting.
So they're clearly, connected to each other. Everything in your brain is connected to everything else. But when we have people who are really depressed and agitated and anxious and strung out, we always treat both sides. Actually, in fact, I've moved to treating everyone with both sides, because the research shows you just get better. They're synergistic and clearly related. So when somebody is anxious, when you treat them on the left side with stimulating OCD, you see a corresponding decrease in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of overactivation. So they're connected.
Interesting.
And given the safety profile of TMS, the risk with TMS is very rare, but there is a risk of seizure because you're activating people's brains. And so people have a very low seizure threshold, or they've had many seizures in the past. It doesn't mean they can't have TMS. It just means we have to get a neurologist on board, maybe, make sure that they're on a good anticonvulsant before we do it. It's generally thought of as a contraindication if you have a seizure disorder, but even people without seizure disorders have been known to have a seizure. The seizures are not particularly dangerous. They're just very unpleasant and scary. You're already in a comfortable chair. Who wants to have a seizure? But it is kind of what's happening in ECT anyway. It's not something you wish for, but it's not a particularly dangerous thing. Seizures can be dangerous, but the ones with TMS have not been dangerous so far.
Yeah, I mean, seizure is such a loaded word, right? I prefer in the neuroscience literature, there's a term called kindling.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
It's much less loaded, right?
It is. Yeah.
It's more like what's actually happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
The neurons are firing and kindling up, and you have just like a sudden kindling of a region of the brain.
Yeah, exactly. Catches fire and then spreads like fire through your brain.
Yeah. So these regions, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is part of the task positive network.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Correct? Yeah.
Correct.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because you have the default mode network.
Mm-hmm.
I like to call it the waking dream, right? It's our best neuroscience for the ego now.
Right.
When the brain and the body is not on task,
Mm-hmm.
we sort of go into this kind of quasi daydreamy state where there's reverie, but when it's overactive, people are perseverating, they're worrying, they're in a thought loop, they're looping and thinking. It's self-referential thinking, it's mental time travel. But when a person is in the task positive network, of which the DLPC is core, so they're like a reciprocal tension system, right? They're like pistons, like the sympathetic system, parasympathetic system. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Like, how does this involve this network neuroscience stuff?
Okay. That's a great observation there. The default mode network is a very important thing to understand for any human being, as far as I'm concerned. The default mode network, as you were describing, is a network. Most of it is kind of down the central part of your brain, but it's a complicated network. And as the name implies, as you were saying, it's on by default, meaning when you are not focused, when you are not engaged in a task, primarily the issue here is focus, then that network is on. And that network, when it's on, is responsible for 98% of human experience. Because, as you said, it is self-referential, it is daydreaming, lost, and almost invariably negative. We evolved primarily as creatures that needed to survive. And so the primates that survived, unfortunately, were the more anxious ones, the ones who kind of woke up when there was a noise in the middle of the night, and the ones who didn't are the ones that got eaten. So we're left with this kind of DNA that has a proclivity toward negative thinking, fearful, foreboding thinking. We're stuck with it. But that is what is on when you're in the default mode network. Nobody walking around the house in a daze is feeling good about life. You don't even know you're alive. You're not even really alive in some ways. And you turn off the default mode network when you focus. And now it really brings us back to all of the great wisdom traditions. I'm sure if the Buddha were interested in neuroscience, he would be very interested in this, because everything that he was trying to teach was designed to turn off the default mode network. Meditation, no matter what form, is a focus activity. It's not a hand-wringing, it's a focus of your attention. And it doesn't really matter, it turns out, whether you focus on your breath or on the image of a flame, or even in psychotherapy, whether you focus on a mental formation. You can focus on an observation that you respond with anxiety to certain kinds of people. Now, just focusing on that relationship itself turns the default mode network off. Psychotherapy is a tool to do this, to turn off the default mode network. Now, it turns out that, as you were saying, everything is connected. So when the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the depression side, is underactive, the default mode network likes to turn on. And when you wake up the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, you generally inhibit the default mode network. Now, exactly as you were saying, the default mode network is responsible for just about all of the mental functions that are challenged when someone is depressed. Decision making, as we all know, when any of us are depressed, you can't make a decision. Focus is inhibited. Memory is inhibited. It's difficult to make new memories. It's difficult to retrieve old memories. Motivation. All of these things are, we can say, mediated by the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. They may not be created by that, but these are things that come up from our limbic system, from the deeper parts of the brain, and they come to the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which makes a decision about what to do with those things. So when that thing is off, you can have all the positive impulses and task-oriented things coming up that you want, but it's not going to make it through the traffic cop. And the traffic cop is not going to know what part of the brain to send it to take action on it. So everything is connected. And then we'll talk about ketamine and its effect on these things as well. There are connections with the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the default mode network too. But this default mode network is, make a big generalization here, a huge generalization. You ready? It's the source of all human suffering. That and clinging to states of mind, to things, to ideas, those two things, that's the ball game. And so now we have at our disposal more and more biological interventions that can do what meditation and psychotherapy do. And what you find, especially with ketamine, which we'll talk about, is that when people undergo ketamine therapy and you put them in an fMRI, when they're really in a state of relief, their brains look very much like the brains of very experienced meditators, especially when those meditators are meditating in an fMRI. So, as you know, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners know, it's tough to get somebody who's really depressed or anxious or overwhelmed to meditate. It's hard enough to just get them to talk, and it's easy for someone who's not depressed to say, if you just meditate, you're going to feel better. So what we can do with these things is give people a taste of what it's like. We're going to jump the line here and give you a taste of what it is like to live without the default mode network on. And then even when people lose that, they've been there and they know that it is achievable. And then they want to work in other ways to get back there. It's very easy for people to judge, other people for not putting in enough effort and all this kind of stuff. The Buddha, who I'm a big fan of, he was very lucky. He was a natural meditator at a very young age, really the age of like 8 or 9. He just sort of discovered it. Now, so for him, it's a little easier to say, just sit down, meditate, focus, hear the techniques, because it came relatively easy to him. Other people, he struggled, don't get me wrong. He didn't figure it out until his mid-30s after a lot of trial and error. But there's some people who are just born with different biology. They're born with different proclivities. They should be able to access those same states. And we can help them. We can get them there. We can't keep them there, but we can give people a sense of what it's like.
I like to tell students meditation is wonderful. A lot of people think, meditation, that has to have a spiritual dimension or a religious dimension. But from a neuroscience perspective, it's simply a task, focusing task.
Exactly right. You can have 20, you can do Tibetan meditation and focus on whatever images or gods or, demigod, whatever they're interested. It's the focus on that. That is the thing.
Yeah. And it's easy to get a meditator in an fMRI, but harder to get somebody that's interested in extreme sports or something like that are deeply in the task network and deeply in some sort of flow state.
Right.
That, is also transcendent as well, if we want to call it that, if we want to call it transcendent, but certainly deeply immersed in a task. It's kind of hard to be depressed. Well, I'm sure people manage to do it, but while you're climbing up a mountain or something like that, or scaling a cliff surface. Right?
Exactly right. And this is one of the reasons that people do those things. Of course, it's not the only reason, but if you picture yourself trying to hit a baseball from a pitcher who's really good, this is not my thing. I don't think I could, even hit off of a junior high pitcher. But when you're focused in that moment, when the pitch is thrown, you are not thinking about your childhood or your anxieties or anything. You're just in that moment. If you are not in that moment, you're going to miss the ball. If you are in that moment and in this, quote unquote flow state, your body knows what to do because it's not running up against all kinds of complexities and conflicts. And I'm not good at this. I'm afraid I'm this and that, like we all feel. When you speak to the great athletes, and you say, what happened when you made that shot? They're like, I don't know. It just seemed like the right thing to do. They're not thinking, am I good enough? Am I this? Am I that? And because they've really mastered the skill of focus, and they're focused. And that's what makes the shot go in. Both ketamine and TMS can give people a taste of that state. And, my comments about Tibetan Buddhism are not meant to denigrate it. It's all great. I'm just trying to, really figure out what is the central joining thing about all these endeavors, psychotherapy, meditation, sports, all these things, writing, creativity. How do these things happen? And their similarities.
You very clearly work with this task network directly. It sounds like on a daily basis. Are there any, and these two frontal, dorsolateral, prefrontal regions, are there any other regions of the brain that you stimulate regularly with the TMS?
The other area that we target is an area that is overactive in OCD. And
the sensory motor.
The supplementary motor area.
Supplementary, SMA.
Yeah. And the SMA, there are people experimenting with lots of different kinds of stimulations. In a clinical setting, I'm very research driven. So I only do the stuff that I'm really comfortable with, that's had multiple articles and tests and challenges. And these three things are studied very extensively. And when you think about the supplementary motor area, in some ways, it makes a certain kind of intuitive sense, and it makes anatomical sense too. OCD, involves intrusive thoughts and compulsions. OCD is very much an action-oriented kind of disorder. When it's uncontrolled, people do things repetitively. They check things. They wash their hands. They avoid things. So when you're toning down the overactivity of the supplementary motor area, it makes a certain kind of intuitive sense that we're addressing something that is happening in OCD. It's a motor illness in some ways. There's obviously a lot going on that we don't know about with OCD, but it does turn out that when you do this with the SMA, you quiet it down, people find relief from OCD. So, yeah.
Very ritualized, very repetitive. I remember going to the San Francisco Zoo and observing the wolverine. And what the wolverine was doing, given its constraints, was basically constantly pacing in the same circle, in the same manner, in such a way that the path was actually carving out downwards by about 2 or 3 feet.
Yeah, wow.
Which is a perfect image for OCD, isn't it?
It's a perfect image, and it's a perfect image for any kind of repetitive activity that your brain engages in. Because when people are depressed or anxious or have OCD, and it's there for many years, a lot of neurological pathways become entrenched. A wolverine walks around the same path over and over. After a while, there's a groove there, and your brain has its equivalents. So that is why it requires some repetitive treatments to help people move away from these kind of repetitive psychological and motor behaviors. Psychological patterns, mental constructs ways of responding to people are develop neurological pathways that are like grooves in the brain. So if the marble's going down the groove, it kind of wants to keep going down that same groove. So what these treatments are doing is kind of pushing the marble in a different way. If you can't do it yourself, these interventions can help. And then you have to run the marble along the new pathways over and over and over, and you establish new networks and more adaptive mental models and constructs.
Mm-hmm. So I read a recent article that basically asserts that pretty much all psychiatric conditions implicate the default mode network. So that includes psychosis. Like the two that I'd like to mention right now are psychotic disorders and autism spectrum disorders.
Mm-hmm.
So complex and heterogeneous terrain, these two.
Mm-hmm.
Do you work with these conditions?
It's an interesting question because there is mounting evidence that autistic spectrum disorders respond to TMS over the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And we've treated a lot of people with autism spectrum disorders who happen to be here for other things, who clearly have a response and whose family members notice a change in their ability to comprehend what's happening socially. They become more aware of other people's facial expressions. They're more naturally attuned. And, one of the great tragedies of autism is that people are not able to read other people's facial expressions. They can't read the room, and they end up being ostracized. There's some research about it. I've seen it happen in several cases. It was not a permanent result, but I've often wondered whether, if I had an autism spectrum disorder and I were interested in working on this, I would consider doing lots of TMS over a long period of time and see what happens, given the safety profile of it. You don't want to play around too much with any of these things because they're powerful interventions, but we've very little tools to treat autism other than early intervention. There are many autistic people who are happy and living a life, but a lot of them are deeply suffering and really not able to describe even what's happening or ask for help, but are kind of trapped in it. Everyone is desperate to find something to help with autism. And, I doubt that TMS is a cure for it, but it may be a way to ameliorate it in an ongoing way.
Yeah. So Dr. Brenner, that I'm a cerebellum researcher.
Yes.
And so there's just radical, incontrovertible evidence that the cerebellum is deeply, deeply implicated in autism spectrum disorders. And the earlier that the cerebellum is damaged, or if there's genetic problems, but the earlier that the damage happens to the cerebellum, a person can become 40 times more likely to develop an autism spectrum disorder. So to me, that lines up with a controlled study about early intervention by a TMS to the cerebellum.
I mean, that's really interesting. I hope somebody is researching that, Yeah. As you know, this is a topic for another conversation, but we were talking before we started about the amazing complexity of the cerebellum. And when I was in medical school, it was really kind of overlooked. It's like, it's responsible for balance and a few other things. But as you know, it's this incredibly complicated part of your brain that's involved in language and just in everything. And I know that there's some relationship between cerebellar dysfunction or different function in autism. And
a deep dive in the literature yielded that the cerebellum is actually part of the default mode network.
Yeah.
And that it has 9 subnetworks within it. So it's just an incredible, it's not under-researched anymore because there's entire books that are published about it and so on. But in terms of the clinical, conscious, direct clinical interventions, I think that there's this, theory lag, right? In science where you get all this wonderful theory stuff and, experimental research, and it could take sometimes 20, 30 years to trickle down into intervention.
Yes.
Yeah. What about with psychosis? Do you use TMS with psychotic disorders?
It's generally not done. And yet there is evidence in the literature that it can help with psychotic disorders. There is no doubt that it helps with psychosis that is a manifestation of profound depression. So when people have major depression with psychotic features, it clearly ameliorates that. When people have schizophrenia and may not be depressed, I don't know that much about the research. There's pieces here and there that it may help reduce certain kinds of auditory hallucinations and so on. But I don't think there's much evidence there for it as an intervention yet, partly because, schizophrenia is a really complex thing and there's all kinds of genetic issues with receptors in various parts of the brain, and it's just not well enough understood. But it's certainly not a contraindication when people are depressed. And when people are depressed and they get psychotic, those psychoses are different than they are in other psychotic disorders. They're what people call egosyntonic delusions that someone is bad or that they're rotting or that they're contagious to other people or worthless, or people can hear voices telling them that they're nothing and they should kill themselves, and they can't distinguish is that
everybody's talking about me, everybody's watching me, everybody's
exactly.
Yeah.
So you have to always be extremely careful, especially with depression, because as people have discovered over many years, when you bring somebody out of depression, you are turning on the task networks. And there's a very sensitive period there where you can awaken the task-oriented networks, but not yet alleviate the depression. And what happens is somebody can become energized enough to hurt themselves. So when somebody is psychotic, you can treat them with TMS, but you have to really monitor closely. You have to control the psychosis. You have to make sure that you're in very close touch with that person and explain to them what might happen. When you explain to people, you may come out of this and you may feel an impulse to harm yourself. If you do, you got to get in touch with me, but also you have to keep in mind that's not the end of the story. But for various reasons, psychosis you have to be very, very careful with. And we generally don't treat people with psychotic disorders with ketamine.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So your approach to psychosis leans on pharmacology and psychotherapy?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, the best that I know of are these very kind of newer interventions, newer medications that are not perfect, but can be. Then there are new medicines like this a medicine called Caplyta that is a new antipsychotic that doesn't cause a lot of the side effects of the older antipsychotics. The older antipsychotics do help psychosis, but they make people feel pretty lousy. They cause weight gain. They can raise your blood sugar. They're flowing drugs. They were originally developed as tranquilizers. So the newer wave of these meds are much more targeted and they don't cause those side effects. But it's, psychosis is really best treated with an alliance with somebody. If you're treating somebody who's psychotic, you have to really put yourself in their shoes and get what they're saying. So if somebody says to you, everybody's talking about me, probably the worst thing you can say is, well, I don't think that's the case. Who's talking about you?
No, they're not.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe one of the best things you can say is, that sounds terrifying.
Yeah.
What an awful feeling. And when you get what somebody's feeling about it, they can begin to trust you. Oh, you get it. And you don't have to get into, is the CIA bugging my room? What matters is it's awful, the idea that you're being watched. Okay. Then when you get an alliance with somebody, they can sometimes almost, you can see paranoia lifting, even briefly, they're like, well, it's not that bad. I don't think it's really happening. But then once you kind of make an alliance with somebody, then you can introduce the biological pieces, like maybe these meds would help it. Maybe they would, if you're seeing like maybe it's in your head, maybe these meds, they may give you some relief. I don't think they have nothing to do with, whether people are watching you, but whether they are or not, it's going to make that experience a lot easier for you and maybe easier to work through. So, ketamine and TMS are not there yet. They're for that kind of intervention. I'm still a believer that you need a connection with somebody. And you need an unusually skilled therapist who knows how to really get, Les Havens, one of my old teachers, he used to call it counter projection, meaning he would say when you're with a psychotic patient and they become paranoid about you, what you try to do is get the projection off of you onto them out there by an alliance. And they may say like, you're one of those doctors, you're part of the system. You can say, oh my God, first of all, maybe I am. And that sucks. You're trying to get help here. And that would suck if I'm part of that system. That would really suck. There is a system out there and you slowly kind of get it off of you, but you don't deny, you just are open to the awfulness of what it would be like if your doctor was part of the CIA, Yeah. And when you're open to that, people are like, yeah, I know you're not part of the CIA, but that's what it feels like. And then you're like, yeah, I get it. And that you need to get that. It's a very rare person who can really do that with psychosis.
Yeah, kind of like, oh yeah, you know what? We are living in a surveillance society.
We are.
Like, oh, yeah, to join in that space of like, I like this idea, counter projection. I do it intuitively. It's like, it's nice to have a name for stuff. Yeah. This new wave of narcotics, they're still dopamine modulators called
other ones like Rexulti and Latuda. They're really complex medicines because there's dopamine, but then there's a whole lot of dopamine, different kinds of dopamine receptors.
Yeah.
There are lots of receptors and neurotransmitters involved in these things. The big ones are dopamine, serotonin, glutamate. And in the beginning, when we only had dopamine agents that block dopamine receptors, people got results and they were like, well, schizophrenia is caused by too much dopamine. And there's something to it because, if somebody takes a huge amount of cocaine and they flood their brains with dopamine, they can get psychotic. But there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
And it's not just one dopamine receptor. So the modern drugs everyone's in a kind of a race to get the best balance between all the different subreceptors to like block some things, be agonists and other receptors. And we have a drug that is really the gold standard for the treatment of severe psychosis, which is Clozaril, which has a lot of these kind of subtle agonist and antagonist properties with different receptors. The problem with Clozaril is that it's a very heavy drug and it makes people gain weight. It's very sedating, but it can work. It's a really useful tool. It can cause this rare disorder with your white blood cells. So you have to check your blood count. The newer ones are really getting closer to being Clozaril without those side effects. Nothing's perfect, but they're much better.
Complex picture. For many, many years, the prevailing psychosis hypothesis, of course, was the dopamine hypothesis. But now we have the glutamate hypothesis, which is a kind of start to the or continuation of the segue into the discussion about ketamine because it works with the glutamate receptor.
Yeah.
But also the endocannabinoid hypothesis of psychosis, which is really, really interesting, right? That it could have something to do with the endocannabinoid system.
Yes. It's so frustrating to me. I really would like to be alive in 200 years when we know a lot more about this. And I don't know if in my lifetime, how far we'll get with this stuff, but who even knows whether all of these receptors are the cause or the effect? Who knows where it's coming from? And the best we can do is modulate the symptoms. And hopefully at some point, somebody's going to figure out the cause and maybe we'll have gene therapy or something like that. But we're getting better at modulating the symptoms.
Yeah.
Not 100% there. Not 100% there.
Before we proceed to ketamine, I was hoping we could just linger for a moment and come back to this thing that you said before about the default mode network, this radical statement that it's like, this is the cause of all suffering, but then you also added clinging to the equation.
Mm-hmm.
When you said that, I was thinking to myself, that's interesting because Dr. Brenner asked you before we clicked record if we needed to nail you down to a specialty in terms of symptom profiles and things like that. Well, it would be one of the things that you said in terms of psychotherapy and TMS and whatnot is identity issues. And I was thinking to myself, gosh, identity, isn't that something that we cling to quite often?
That's a really great point because clinging in the default mode network is the root of all human suffering. I'll come back to my crazy generalization. The other root of human suffering is identity. The idea that you are a personality, and it's a serious, serious problem. It sounds funny to say because so much of our civilization is based on developing a sense of identity and nurturing a sense of identity. And there can be many positive aspects to that. And in many ways, Western psychology is very focused on identity. But it's also a construct. And the problem with a construct about who you are is that you're never that person. And you will die trying to make everyone believe that you are that person that you know that you are. It's endlessly disappointing. And for some reason, we all believe that clinging to an identity is what's going to save us. And I am more and more convinced that, for many people, that is helpful. But to my mind, dissolving that is really a better way, letting go of it and seeing what you are in your totality, whatever you are. Identity is a construct, and we can sort of prove it by just making the observation that, with you, I'm one way. With my wife, I'm a different person. With my kids, I'm a different person. So how can that be one identity? When I'm anxious, I'm one person. When I'm confident, I'm another person. So it's a really malleable thing, but we're all clinging to it. And it's really rooted for most people in the idea that I am a good person. I don't harm people. And really, when you get down to the bottom of it, it's about a feeling that if you are good and you don't harm people, you will be loved. So what's driving a lot of us is a need for safety, and safety comes from a feeling of being loved when you're younger. So this is idealistic of me, but you hope that over the course of a life, you move from needing to be loved to loving. When you make that shift, you're always with love. When you're wanting to be loved, it's great when you got it, but it's never going to last. It's never going to last with any individual person. You can have the happiest marriage in the world. Sometimes, I'm sorry, your spouse doesn't love you. They're disgusted or whatever, it's never going to work out. So there's clinging here to the idea that you're good and the feeling that if I'm good, everyone's going to love me. And it's very scary to suggest that you could let go of that, because then what the hell are you? You're just this thing existing and looking out through your eyes. Like, then what am I? That's a very intimidating notion to people. It's intimidating to me sometimes. But clinging is related to identity in that way. Identity is a huge impediment.
Yeah, in my book, I have this section revolving around this term that I call the identity wars. We're in the time of the identity wars, as if that were new, right? It's always been the identity wars.
It's an interesting way of phrasing it because it's very evocative. There is a war going on. between your identity, alternate identities, you and other people, because you're fighting with them so that they see your true identity, and you're not wrong. I'm not wrong. It's everyone else.
Yeah.
And
just like people throw out Freud a lot now these days as kind of just being kind of backwards and Victorian or patriarchal or whatever. But the original genius there is just like, wake up, we're all aggressive. We have aggressive drives, and the position of, I'm not aggressive. The one over on the other side of that hill over there is aggressive.
Right.
Is not a realistic position. It's just not, it's delusional.
It is delusional. And it's dangerous too, because when you cannot integrate the good and the bad in you, you're going to split the good and the bad, and you're good and they're bad. And this is what we see in politics these days. We have a president coming to office who, you're not supposed to diagnose people from afar, and I won't diagnose him from afar, but it's pretty obvious to everyone that he has a lot of narcissistic personality traits. And what is characteristic of people with those personality styles is the tendency to split. So you see, you're the good one, and you collect people around you who affirm your goodness, and they're good too. And because you can't tolerate that people are both good and bad, because you're so desperate to be safe in your goodness, that before you know it, you've split those people off into the bad ones. And before you know it, around a person who uses splitting, those people outside the person are fighting with each other. So, in some ways you could make a case that this is kind of what's happening to the country under the influence of a person who uses splitting. We all use splitting to some extent. It's a natural thing, through adolescence at least, but you hope that people come to realize, we're all a mix of things, and I don't begrudge someone who got angry at me or disagreed with me. It's complicated. This is what Freud was trying to wake us up to. And Freud people don't recognize that, like, he was doing this in a vacuum. He made this shit up out of nothing. And it's incredible what he was able to do in a single lifetime. Okay, he's not perfect. He made a lot of mistakes, but he was trying to outline all these parts of the human experience. Okay. Yeah. So let's give him a little leeway there. Like, you try it. That's what, that's the way I feel sometimes. But
I have another section called deconstructing innocence, because I believe that one of the primary functions or results, or let's say intentions, unconscious intentions to maintain this split is to maintain innocence.
Absolutely.
I'm innocent. I'm good. The one over there holds the stuff that I don't have. Right. They're my garbage dump. I just, project all my garbage onto the other.
Exactly.
And I don't have that, so I can maintain my purity and innocence.
And innocence is how you describe a baby, right?
Yeah.
And that's the way we believe we have to be loved. It's, and being loved means that you're safe. So these are early childhood things that, when they're not resolved, can be disastrous for a life. You're clinging on to your idea that you're innocent. It's going to come back to haunt you. You're not. None of us are. We all can be greedy. We all are greedy. In fact, I would say we're all greedy. It's in our DNA. We wouldn't be here if we weren't greedy. We're all jealous. We're all these things. When you see it, when you undergo an exercise in trying to say, oh my God, all this stuff is in me, in the best of moments, you can say, that's in me. This is what I am. I'm going to try to see it. I'm going to see myself and other people the way it is. And when you see that, it's much easier to love people.
Yeah.
My sister or my brother is not perfect. We were competing for the same attention. All right. I get that. I can love my sibling with all their messy stuff. But if I need them to be all good or all bad, that's going to break down eventually, because they're not all good and they're not all bad. And eventually you're going to come face to face with that delusional split, and it's not going to go well for you.
So let's talk about psychedelics. I mean, technically, ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, but like functionally, how it shows up is it does have this psychedelic element to it. Yeah.
Yes, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Let's talk about ketamine and how it works. And then let's talk about the psychedelic properties of it and how that works as well.
Yeah.
So ketamine was originally developed as an anesthetic. It's kind of related to PCP in some ways. It turns out to be an extremely useful anesthetic at very high doses and used by militaries all over the world. In fact, it's the most widely used anesthetic around the world. It's in every emergency room. It's on the World Health Organization list of essential medicines. It's really valuable. It's used a lot with children, and it's used all the time with animals because you can administer a big dose of ketamine, anesthetize a living thing, and perform surgery. And it does not impair their respiration, doesn't affect their cardiovascular system in any dramatic way. It can raise your blood pressure a little bit. So it was used for many, many years as an anesthetic. The problem with it as an anesthetic is what you were referring to, which is that at lower doses, when you are awake, it is a psychedelic, essentially. It is a dissociative drug. So
I was interested in the experience of nurses when people are waking up from anesthesia for exactly this reason.
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, I've seen it many, many times. For people who have used just ketamine for surgery, there's a come down from it when they wake up that can be really overwhelming. They don't know who they are, where they are, what the hell's going on. They can get paranoid and afraid. But it was also later discovered by accident through the study of mice and rats to be an antidepressant at low doses. So just to give you a sense of where this came from, there was a researcher at the University of Chicago who was doing a certain experiment with learned helplessness with mice and rats. And kind of a cruel scenario, but they were putting them in bowls of water and letting them swim until they couldn't swim anymore. Then they would take them out. Not fair, not nice. But what they found is that some mice learn helplessness. So pretty quickly they give up. You put them in 4 or 5 times, then the next time you put them in, they stop swimming. They're just like not going anywhere. Others last longer. Some really never get there, but it's a rare animal that never gives up. But they were anesthetizing them to do other research, and they found that the animals that were given ketamine started to never give up. Next time they went back into the water, they never gave up. And they started to present, there are research models of mouse and rat depression, and they started to present as not depressed. So, they measure it with activity and interaction and all these different things. So some brave researchers decided to try this in human beings. And it turns out it does the same thing, if not better, in human beings. So when you administer ketamine in a low dose, a sub-anesthetic dose, but enough of a dose that you get loopy, and you keep a steady level in someone's body for 40 minutes, you precipitate changes in your brain that are multifaceted and very quickly lead to resolution of depression and anxiety. It's the most dramatic intervention I've come across in my career. And it's almost, I've described this to other people as humiliating because, we've spent all these years working on these other therapy and all these meds. And then suddenly ketamine comes along and it produces this transformation, sometimes in a matter of hours. Sometimes it can take 2 weeks, sometimes a little longer, and it doesn't work 100% of the time. But when it works, there is nothing more dramatic to see than the lifting of depression. Now, it's important to understand how ketamine works and why it is different. As you mentioned, it works with a different receptor system than all of the other drugs. The Prozacs and Zolofts and all those things, they work with serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine primarily. ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. So it blocks the effect of glutamate at a receptor. That has this cascading effect on a whole bunch of subsystems. What happens is that when you block the NMDA receptor in certain parts of your brain, there's a cascading effect that leads to a deactivation of a specific part of your brain that's located in a part of your brain that I certainly didn't learn about in medical school, but I've since learned a lot about, called the lateral habenula. The lateral habenula turns out to be either the source or the spata. We don't know what causes what, but it is the area of your brain that is responsible for all of the self-regulatory, self-critical, self-inhibiting impulses. So as near as you can get to it in psychoanalytic theory is a superego. I mean, it's literally like your superego. When you administer ketamine, you turn off the lateral habenula. When you turn off the lateral habenula, all of these negative thoughts and impulses dissipate. So feelings that I'm worthless, feelings that I should kill myself, a feeling that I need to harm myself, a feeling that I'm not good at anything. All those things abate. And when you turn that off, you also turn off the default mode network. So now we have an antidepressant that in many ways works in a way that's entirely opposite to the traditional antidepressants. Those drugs are trying to boost the functioning of certain networks by making more neurotransmitter available. This is working in the opposite way. So it's very much like being in a car with your foot on the gas and your foot on the brake and relieving the pressure on the brake. The car is overheating. It's not going anyplace. You have plenty of gas. What you are struggling with is brake. So ketamine introduces a new model of depression that it may not be so much about a lack of stimulating, activating kinds of networks and impulses. It may be that it's primarily because there's too much inhibition. So ketamine works in 85% of people when we think about people with treatment-resistant depression. So these are people who've tried multiple antidepressants, psychotherapy, adjunctive agents like the second-generation antipsychotics and stuff. It works 85% of the time. Now, that kind of upends certainly my understanding of what is happening in depression. And what you find when people go through ketamine therapy is that at the end, if they're lucky and they respond, they find a much more centered place in which they become much more accepting of themselves and other people. They start to see clearly. When you turn off all that negative stuff inside and you turn off your identity in a certain way, you start to see other people and yourself much more openly. And here's where it's the perfect adjunct to psychotherapy, because what we're trying to do as therapists a lot of the time is build an alliance with somebody and help turn that self-critical stuff down so that they can see what's really happening in their minds. And that can take years. Ketamine is one of these things that happens to do it in a matter of hours or days. So the effect of ketamine is that it quiets this inhibitory, self-punishing part, and it turns off the default mode network. And when you do those two things, people are not depressed anymore. Even more striking is that when people are acutely suicidal or cutting themselves or burning themselves, which we see all the time in psychiatric practice, and any clinician does, you can administer ketamine to someone who has burn marks and a recent cut, and wants to kill themselves. And I know it sounds magical, but in a number of people, 2 hours later, that's all gone. Now, it may come flooding back, but it's all gone. And when you take people who have that impulse toward suicide and self-harm and you treat them with repetitive treatments, let's say 8 infusions over 4 weeks, you see this whole thing dissipate. Ketamine has advantages and disadvantages. Okay. The advantages of ketamine are that it works very quickly. It's very, very safe. The disadvantages of it are, which is also an advantage, is that when you're undergoing ketamine therapy, you are put into a slightly psychedelic state. It's not quite the same as other psychedelics because it's an anesthetic really at higher doses. So what's happening with ketamine is that you're taking a few steps toward general anesthesia. And in general anesthesia, your brain doesn't shut off. Basically, all the subnetworks just disconnect from each other. So, who knows, you may be experiencing pain, but you're not aware of it, and you're not going to be aware of it. So we're giving people a little taste of that, and their identities dissolve as well. Very often, in the middle of a ketamine infusion, somebody will say, "Who am I?" Let's blurt it out like, "Who am I? Am I alive? Am I dead?" They lose any of the grounding ideas that they had about themselves. And that's very intimidating to some people, but for most people can be profoundly liberating. They may be anxious in the moment, but when you prepare somebody for that experience and you work with them before they undergo an infusion and you say, "Look, here's what it's going to be like. You're going to go, you sit at Cambridge Biotherapy's beautiful room, super comfortable chair, one person with you the whole time. And you're going to put in an IV and start this slow drip of this medicine. And you're going to have a weighted blanket and we're going to take really good care of you. And we have music that you can listen to and eye shades and you're going to go into an altered state. And if you prepare people and you say, it's going to be different than anything you've ever experienced. It's going to be different each time you do the ketamine, but your job is to just let it happen. Just let it happen. If you feel joy, you feel joy. If you feel scared, you feel scared. If you need help, we're there to help you. If it's overwhelming, we stop the infusion. You're in control. And when people know they're in control, they can tolerate a lot more. So a lot with ketamine comes from the preparation, the mindset. You're going in there for a good reason. You're in a safe place with good people who know what they're doing, and you're going to be taken care of. And if anything goes wrong, we got you. And almost never does anything go wrong. What goes wrong sometimes is that people can have overwhelming reactions of fear. But this happens with any psychedelic. They can become overwhelmed with some emotion. So this is why when you use ketamine or you treat someone with ketamine, you must be prepared. You have to have done the work beforehand. You have to know what to do if somebody has a meltdown. It's rare. You have to have other meds at your disposal. Sometimes a little Ativan helps, sometimes a hot towel helps. But I'm very interested in more people having access to ketamine, but I'm worried about the kind of home use of ketamine because for many people, it's great. For some people, it's traumatic.
Yeah.
And it's not the greatest idea. I prescribe nasal ketamine in rare circumstances for people that they can use at home, but only after they've had multiple infusions and we know how they respond. And they've learned self-soothing mechanisms and we teach them and we have them self-administer it in the clinic first. And that we do only for people who really can't afford the IV treatment because it's not as effective as the IV. So I always want to give people what is best, but if that's just completely out of reach, we can sometimes do that. So ketamine is another window into what's going on in our brains and in our mind. And the power of these inhibitory networks. We are social animals. Snakes, they're perfectly fine on their own. They don't need to be liked by other snakes. Human beings, we evolved, in groups of 100, 150. You got to be part of the group. If you're not part of the group, you're screwed. So you got to go hook, line, and sinker with whatever they believe, rational or irrational. And you've got to control your impulses, because you know what? They don't like it when you beat somebody up because they didn't give you enough mayonnaise on your sandwich. You do that stuff, you're going to be ostracized. So we have got all these self-control networks. I'm bad. That was bad. And it's a way of maintaining your connection to your group. So that becomes a whole hypertrophic inner thing in depression. It's just run amok. And this is really opening up a new way, for me at least, to see depression. That it's less about the innate energy of someone and more about the inhibitory networks and mental formations. So it works in a totally different way. And there's no one right thing for any person. You need a lot of experience with these things to be able to say, I think TMS might be better, or I think ketamine might be better, or I think. Now, the other thing that's amazing with ketamine is that when you prepare someone and you get to know them and you meet them and you set out intentions and mental models of what's happening in your mind, and then you sit with them while they're having a ketamine infusion, and you are with them and encourage them to just go with whatever is there, and then talk with them afterwards, and then meet with them the next day to process what happened. You can find incredible things happening in someone's psychological development, in part because the ketamine itself is already doing what we're trying to do when we're building an alliance with somebody and calm down their superego. But then also, as you were getting to, the psychedelic aspect of it is itself valuable if you prepare and you make use of it. Psychedelics, so far, there's a lot of good research about psychedelics for trauma. There's very little to explain the biology of it. Mostly, in my opinion, the benefit of the psychedelics is the mind-opening experience. So an analogy that makes sense to me is, if you're wandering around in a forest and you're lost, you're in despair, you can't get out, you're in the default mode network. If you have the opportunity to walk up to the top of a mountain and survey the whole forest, you can see, oh, I'm in the dark part. There are the edges. That's a different area over there. Then when you go back down into the forest, now you're carrying that view of it with you. Now I'm just going to keep going through this. It's just a forest. I'm going to keep going. So ketamine has that aspect to it as well. People have insights in these states. It's ego dissolving in a very helpful way. So it's useful in a lot of ways. It's useful just as a medicine, but it's really powerful when you do it with therapy.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how you'll respond to the following joke that I like to tell.
All right.
My joke is that the people that need psychedelics the most are the ones that are least likely to use them.
That is exactly on point. Exactly. Yeah. And are the most at risk if they use them, because they can be shattered and they can be opened and transformed with the right preparation and care, but they can also be overwhelmed with fear. And, in the right setting, we want to welcome fear, So if you're with somebody and they're having a psychedelic experience, you can really help them if they say, there are terrible forces coming to get me. If they're completely hyperventilating, you can help them calm down with breathing and so on. But you can also say, wow, that's great. What is it? What are those forces? And you can be like a co-pilot, like, wow, let's go toward that thing. Oh, there's a monster there. What does it look like? Let's invite that monster and let's invite that guy in for tea. Let's have him sit down. Tell us all about, why are you so upset, Mr. Monster? What are you trying to do here? And you start to invite people to see all of these things as aspects of themselves that are there trying to help them. What is fear? Fear is a part of yourself that's trying to keep you safe. So you can say to your fear in this state, you know what? I appreciate the good work you've done. You've really helped me stay safe. I want you to come inside, just chill out. Maybe I think you can retire. You've done a great job. Here's an award, I don't think I need you in the same way anymore. But you don't get very far by saying, I'm going to fight against my fear.
Mm-hmm.
It's paradoxically the opposite. Come on inside. Shame. I see. You're my shame. You've been trying to keep me from making a fool of myself. Thank you. You have really helped me stay safe. I've paid a price for it because I don't do anything and I don't talk to anybody and I live with too much shame, but you had good intentions. So chill out, you did a great job. It's sort of the opposite of what our impulse is, to control, to fight with it, So psychedelics and ketamine especially have this helpful way of opening the heart to acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's acceptance, like we were talking about with splitting, you start to see things the way they are. And when you see things the way they are, your heart opens for all the good and the bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always pretty, but when you're not fighting against the way it is, you see it. And when you see it the way it is, it's the most liberating experience. You can only really love someone deeply, I think, maybe this is too big a statement, when you see what's really happening, who they really are, who you really are. You see all of your messy DNA and your love, and you see it in the other person and you accept it.
Mm-hmm.
You know who they are.
Yeah. I'm reminded of this thing that you shared about your first therapy with Mr. Oken. Was it Oken? Mr.
Yes,
Oken.
Robert Oken. Yeah.
Robert Oken.
Yeah.
And how there was a fierce encounter
Mm-hmm.
there that worked for you. And it's almost like sometimes in therapy, I do feel like there's too much, there's like too much obsession with safety and a type of risk aversion. Now, obviously we're going to try to minimize risk. Hence the joke, right? The people that need psychedelics the most are the ones that are least likely to use them. It's a risk for them to let go of their defense, their psychological defenses, right?
Absolutely.
But Mr. Oken knew this stuff.
Yeah.
He wasn't a risk-averse therapist.
No, he was not. And that's a very, very helpful observation, because one of the things that happened, the reason it was right for me at that point in my life, was that he was very challenging of me. And by being challenging of me, he was showing his faith that I could handle it. What he would come after my defenses, he'd come after the way I was, what my expression was, how I was sitting, what I was avoiding, what I was not avoiding. And it was very in your face. And it was scary, but then became very liberating, exhilarating. Like, oh my God. Yeah. I stopped being afraid of being seen, because he's just like, he took the hammer and he was like, I'm cracking open the shell. Here we are. I trusted him, and I was right to trust him. You have to be with somebody that you can trust, and that whatever they're doing, if they're challenging you, they're trying to get to the truth and to the love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not like it's a one size fits all, right? Therapy is an art, just as much as it is a science.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is there anything that you'd like to pitch to the audience before we come to completion here?
Wow, there's a lot. It's an interesting question. If people are interested in ketamine, there's an interesting book that was written quite a while ago called the Ketamine Papers that has a lot of interesting descriptions of the experience. What I would pitch to the audience is to explore. You know, the Buddha who we were talking about, one of his great qualities was that he was an explorer. He tried all different kinds of things. He tried asceticism. He tried fasting. He tried holding his arm, all these crazy things. And he explored until he found what worked for him. And people need some invitation to explore. So, I mean, I can make a direct pitch. If anyone's interested in this stuff, they can get in contact with me. They can call Cambridge Biotherapies, and we would start with a whole evaluation. And we're not in the business of trying to sell people one thing or another, but you start with a consultation and you go through the whole story and see what makes sense. Where are you in your life? What are you struggling with? What are the challenges? What are you hoping for? And there are many routes to freedom, but you have to start with curiosity, and you have to sometimes in the beginning push yourself to take a risk, and you do it in a moderated way. Just because let's say you come to see somebody at Cambridge Biotherapies for consultation, you don't have to do anything that's recommended, but you should feel free to explore it and be your own judge. But do it with people that know what they're doing. That's wherever you are. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brenner, for joining us on the show.
Really a pleasure. Really. I mean, you're really an excellent interviewer, and you know, I could talk to you for hours and hours, and I can see why you have a great podcast. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm, we're a colony, we're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.